Okay, we're going to now begin our little section here on the autobiographical sketch by Margaret Fuller, but a few background things that you might be interested in. Fuller is probably the greatest female intellectual in America during the 19th century. I mean, I can't think of anybody who would rival her in intellectual power, ability. I'm not saying that she was a great writer necessarily. I think her writing sometimes leaves a lot to be desired, and I don't know that she was a huge public figure, although she had fame. That's true, she's probably the best educated intellectual as a woman, and probably one of the best in the Western world at the time. And I guess, if you make your kid miserable by making them study all the time, they're bound to end up learning something, aren't they? She was part of the group known as the Transcendentalists, who were centered up in the Boston area. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, these kinds of folks. Louisa May Alcott's dad, which we'll bring up in a little bit, was part of that group of individuals, and they were kind of an offshoot of Unitarianism, they were very much in the Northeast or northeastern United States, and politically quite liberal. Especially socially as well. They tended to be very much in opposition to slavery and these kinds of things. But they started their own magazine. They gave lots of lectures, published a number of books. It's not that any one of them was, sort of a big publishing or writing powerhouse. It's that they were very important in starting up groups and individuals who became very important, who were connected to them. So not everybody who was significant as a writer was a transcendentalist, but almost all the significant writers like Hawthorne and Melville and Poe and these folks knew the transcendentalists and hung out with them to at least a greater or lesser extent. So she was part of that circle, and a very intimate part of that circle, the most prominent female in the transcendentalist group for sure. What we see with Fuller and her life, and you see it through her writing, certainly this work and one I'm going to allude to here in just a moment, is something of a conundrum. And the conundrum is of the so-called overly educated woman. Now, if you say that out of context, people think, what do you mean? It's not possible to be overly educated. Well, it's an issue, isn't it? I mean, most women, especially women who are very well educated, will sometimes say that even today they face a bit of a conundrum because society, has certain ambivalent attitudes towards women who are academically accomplished. If you don't believe that, become a professor and you see it, even if you're male, that there are some sort of ambivalent attitudes towards it, right? We see this sometimes with even little girls who early on in their education strive to achieve, and then sometimes when they hit, middle school and high school, sort of take their foot off the gas academically because they're, worried about appearing to be too smart, kind of thing, right? We still battle that, I think, to a large extent. A lot of girls deal with that, and but certainly that today's difficulties certainly pale in comparison to what women faced back 150 years ago. The conundrum is, you've got a woman here who has been very, very highly educated, an extremely well-versed individual, someone who's widely read, who was accomplished in history, philosophy, languages, art, mathematics, science. And then what does she do with it all? And she laments this to some extent, that her father set about putting her on this track of incredibly rigorous academic preparation, and there's no place for her to be able to use it. There's no acceptable position for her to use it. Now, to give you a little bit of background, Fuller does go on to become an important writer and lecturer, one of, a real trailblazer in that respect, because most women did not do that kind of thing. And eventually she became a columnist for the New York Tribune. And even when she moved to Italy, met a count and got married and had kids with him, she was writing from overseas as a correspondent, and so she found a niche for herself as a writer and was quite a great writer. Personality-wise, I gotta say this, is that she's not the most fun to read because she, in a way, sometimes overcompensates. I'm just being honest here. She wasn't taken as seriously as a lot of male writers, and as a result, she kind of compounded people's animosity towards her by sort of overdoing it, showboating a bit on her, education, dropping names and titles and such. You don't see it in this text. That's a good thing. But she does it a lot in order to make it clear that, yes, I am a very well-educated person. I think she can be forgiven for that, don't you? Here she is trying to be taken seriously. It's kind of like the kid in the front row who's got his hand up all the time. Ooh, call on me. Ooh, I know the answer, teacher. And it's like, yeah, but the kid's been kicked around a lot, so you can't blame him. Okay, so you have to kind of take it with a grain of salt. It leads us to the issue, this text and her life leads us to this really important issue of education for women in the 19th century. Prior to about the mid-19th century, women's education largely just ended after some basic rudimentary grade school kind of things. Even the best educated, even the highest social class women in the United States and Britain didn't typically go beyond what we would consider to be about a 7th grade education, maybe 6th grade. I mean, they would be taught to read and write. They would be taught, some basic arithmetic, but you wouldn't really get into questions of philosophy at all. They'd be given some exposure to literature, but beyond that, they largely, depending on their social status, if they were working class, they would go to work. If they were a farmer's wife, they would work on a farm. If they worked in a factory, they worked in a factory, right? But if they were upper class, then most of the attention was dedicated to teaching them things like music, art, knitting, like, needlepoint, singing, sometimes foreign languages, yes. They would spend their time reading literature, pleasure literature, and all of this was in order to make them more refined, and I'm using quotation marks you can't see, refined, and in other words, educated in one sense, in ways that would make them socially fluent, as opposed to academically fluent. By socially fluent, they would be able to appreciate, understand, and sometimes perform artwork, music, all those kinds of things. This is what an upper class woman would do with her time. And aside from appreciating art and music and light literature, and all of the rest of her life was really to be devoted to her children and her family, and that meant, expressing herself through sort of civic causes, domestic activities like needlepoint and knitting and those kinds of things. You and I might say, well, that's kind of boring, right? I know, and a lot of women probably did find it terribly boring and unfulfilling. But again, these were upper class women, so Fuller wouldn't be considered upper class, but she was from a family of means. Her father was a lawyer, as you know, and made pretty good money and was able to provide well for them. They had servants. Almost everyone who was middle class had servants. This is doesn't mean that they were rich. That just tells you how many poor people there were who basically worked for nothing more than, a roof over their head and food. So a lot of people had servants. You had to have servants because it was difficult to run a household with a lot of kids. I mean, think about the laundry alone that you would have to do without any modern conveniences, the dishes and the cooking and all of that kind of stuff, the cleaning that had to be done. So an upper class woman or an educated woman didn't do all those things. She had servants to do those kinds of things. And so what did she do with her time? She did civic things, church things, charitable things, social causes, and then took care of her family with respect to some of her other things and taught her children in her home frequently and that sort of thing. What you have, though, in the 19th century is this emergence of a desire on the part of many women to receive more than just that basic rudimentary grade school kind of education. And some of the upper class families begin to decide that, especially as they get to be teenagers, it would be a good idea to send these young women off to finishing schools, boarding schools, and what eventually became women's colleges. If you look at all the great women's colleges up and down the eastern seaboard, you will see that many of them started off kind of as sort of like academic finishing schools, and I think to the credit of a lot of mothers of these young women, they insisted that the girls receive something a little bit more than just basic arithmetic and basic reading and writing. They wanted them to be better educated than that. And the argument was, you know, if you educate these young women better, then they become better social companions and they become better members of the community and those kinds of things for their husbands and all of that. So that was kind of the argument. The other thing too was it was, you know, became fashionable to do it and say, you know, if you've got the money to send your daughter off to Smith or Barnard or something like that, Southern Seminary or something of that nature, then you would do that. And so a lot of these colleges, tiny little colleges, popped up. Sweetbriar, which has been in the news lately, is a kind of a college that was along those lines, designed for upper-class young women off in the rural countryside, and there was usually a lot of horseback riding going on as well. So, and it was a place that you would go, sometimes just 2 years. Many of these schools were just 2-year schools, and then later they became 4-year schools, and some of them now are research institutions. But back in the day, Harvard was the school for boys, and Smith was the girls' school. Now, of course, they're both together, and they're both co-educational. One of the biggest works that she wrote, and we're not reading an excerpt from it because it can be a little tedious, but it is important, is a book she wrote called Woman in the 19th Century that has 3 major points in it that are truly radical and truly revolutionary. I think Margaret Fuller has to be probably one of the earliest, most outspoken people on behalf of the women's movement. You know, everybody remembers all of the big names, you know, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony and all of these other people who were really big names of the women's rights movement, and people forget about Margaret Fuller. And the reason they do is because Margaret Fuller was actually earlier than they were, and she died soon. Or earlier, I should say, than they did. She did attend the Women's Rights Convention at Seneca Falls in 1848. She was the first to really write a manifesto about why women deserve equal rights and equal opportunities, and that book is called Woman in the 19th Century. The argument that she makes, which is a very compelling philosophical argument, is that men and women are complementary in nature. They're not identical. They should be, however, treated equally, even though they are different in many respects and have different sort of sensibilities and strengths and those kinds of things, that just because they're not the same doesn't mean they're not equal, that they're complementary, and that the development of both men and women educationally and socially and professionally is necessary for the advancement of civilization. Civilization will never advance out of a state of barbarity and into a state of enlightenment unless both genders are equally allowed to reach their full potential. She argues that opportunity should be based really on aptitude, not on gender, so that if a woman is capable of doing something, being a tugboat captain or being a math professor or being an engineer or an architect, that she ought to be allowed to do that. That ought not be based on her gender, but should be based on her aptitude. Now remember, you and I are like, yeah, so when are you getting to the radical part? That was the radical part back then, okay? Because the big argument was, whoa, wait. If women are allowed to do this, no woman will want to be a mom anymore. I know it sounds really kind of weird. It's like, but they'll all run off and abandon their families. We can't let them do this. We can't let them be tugboat captains, because then they'll want to do that, and they won't want to stay home, and they won't want to have children, they won't have family. They'll run away and just become, I don't know, Amazon women who just do their own thing. How are we going to ever have families? They'll just run away and all of this kind of thing. She makes quite a patient argument in there, saying that's not going to make women abandon their families. There will be, she says, some women who choose not to marry and not to have children, and that is their God-given right. But most women will want to do what they want to do, and if a woman wants to do it, they ought to be able to do it. Many women will decide singlehood is a great choice. Others will decide that they want to enter the workforce at some point in their lives, or maybe their whole lives, or none of it, whatever. But she says it's just not true. There's not a threat to the American family. Remember, in the 19th century, there was this cult of domesticity. There was this cult of the family. I mean, the family was everything. Remember, we talked about Harriet Beecher Stowe's principal argument in Uncle Tom's Cabin against slavery wasn't a political one so much. It was a moral and social one about how slavery was destroying the family. That is how you convince a Victorian to do something. If you can convince them that it's going to have an effect on the family, positive or negative, that gets their attention. And so in this text that she wrote, Woman in the 19th Century, she says, my biggest argument is that by guaranteeing women's rights educationally, academically, in terms of the workforce, what will that do to the family? And she has to make a really great case that it won't create the destruction of the American family, and she does it pretty ably. It was not a highly received book. I mean, there were an awful lot of men who thought this is nothing. I don't care for this, and this is claptrap and sedition and all that kind of stuff. But it got enough, I think, important, well-educated women thinking that the conversational ball had begun, and sadly, Fuller doesn't get the kind of credit I think she deserves for having started this. It's all these later folks in the suffrage movement that get a lot of credit, but there wouldn't have been a suffrage movement had there not been a Margaret Fuller. We can put it that way. I think that's pretty safe to say.